father stumbles upon young Blaise, aged 12, making some signs on the floor with a bit of chalk, and he suddenly realizes that basically Pascal has discovered Euclidean geometry on his own.
Just off his own bat. Wow. We are so pleased for our second ever returning guest, Graham Tomlin, who is in fact the director of the Centre for Cultural Witness, editor-in-chief of Seen and Unseen. He was the very first guest. We're going to be exploring your latest book, Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world.
His father kind of recognized that he had a bit of a child genius. He's right at the heart of the kind of rising tide of science in 17th century Europe. He has a real kind of interest in those kind of questions, not just in the science itself, but if you like, the sort of philosophy of science. On a November night in 1654, he writes about how he seems to have had this very visceral, powerful experience of the presence of God. And he desperately wants to communicate this to his sophisticated friends who don't take religion very seriously, find God rather boring. And so it has this practical effect on what he does. The kind of Christian faith he talks about is one which is, if you're going to do this thing, do it properly. This is a passionate God who possesses your heart and who captures your imagination.
Where he talks about religion, he says, make it attractive, make good men, wish it were true, and then show them that it is. How attractive do you think Christianity is right now? If Blaise Pascal could look at the way how we're doing, what would he say? Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I'm Belle Tyndall.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we're here for another Re-Enchanting conversation where we wonder, have we lost it? Are we craving it? Is the Christian story a place where we can find it?
And we are so pleased for our second ever returning guest joining us today, Graham Tomlin, who is in fact the director of the Centre for Cultural Witness, editor-in-chief of Seen and Unseen. He was the very first guest on the Re-Enchanting podcast series. So welcome back, Graham.
Lovely to be back.
You are the former Bishop of Kensington. You've been involved in theological education, cultural engagement for several years. And your latest book is Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world. So today we're going to be exploring the life and legacy of Blaise Pascal, who was, I suppose, a polymath is one way of describing him in a relatively short lifetime, but he made contributions to science, mathematics, technology, culture, and offered arguments for Christianity that's still being widely discussed today. So today, Graham, with your help, we're going to attempt to re-enchant Blaise Pascal, the man who made the world. Welcome along.
Thank you. No, looking forward to the conversation. Should be great.
It absolutely will be. But seeing as you are a returning guest, it should come, and an avid listener, I trust.
Absolutely avid, exactly. Listen to you all the time.
So it should come as no surprise that the first thing we're going to ask you, there's an ode to Lambeth Palace Library where we find ourselves, is what you're reading.
Yeah, well, I guess like a lot of your guests, I'm a serial. Well, I read a number of books at the same time. I don't sort of tend to go to one after the other. And I tried to read something more kind of general, a novel or a sort of book about something going on in the sort of wider world, but also something theological or something kind of historical at the same time. So at the moment, I'm reading, actually, funny enough, a book I picked up because of Re-Enchanting. So I think it was your episode recently with Tyler Staton.
Yes.
Or I think you asked him the same question. He said he was reading this book, H is for Hawk.
Yeah.
And then you, Belle, said you were reading it as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I kind of thought, well, if Tyler Staton and Belle Tyndall are reading it, maybe I should read it too.
Double whammy,
I feel left out. I haven't started reading H's for Hawk, but I feel like I should join the gang.
I'll lend you my copy.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
So it's an extraordinary book about, someone sort of dealing with grief, the loss of a father, but also trying to train a wild hawk at the same time. So I'm kind of partway through that. That's my sort of bedtime reading. I usually try and read something before I go to bed at night. But I suppose my sort of theological, historical reading is it's a really interesting book at the moment called The Patient Ferment in the Early Church by Michael Allen Kreider. And it's basically, I think the subtitle is The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Greco-Roman World, or in the Roman Empire, I think it was. And he's trying to kind of to account for how did this tiny sect that seemed to be so insignificant grow to become the kind of dominant religion of the Western world in a relatively short period of time. Although he kind of makes the point, actually, it's quite a long period of time because they were pretty patient about it. They didn't push it. and there weren't great strategies as to how they were going to take over the world. It actually happened through very kind of normal, ordinary ways of sharing faith and living out faith as a distinct way of life. So that the idea of the patient ferment of the early church. So that's what I'm reading right now.
I mean, that brings us neatly actually to something that I wanted to talk with you about before we jump into Blaise Pascal, which is I often think that despite all our attempts at grand strategies and evangelization programs in the church, often things happen kind of despite us. And it's because kind of the changing nature of the culture around us. And, you know, it's been 2 years since you were with us here on Re-Enchanting. And we started by talking about some of those interesting things going on in culture that suggest people are craving re-enchantment, looking again towards spirituality. And we now come to recording this just you know, having fairly recently heard about this so-called quiet revival that the Bible study are talking about, some quite extraordinary really statistics showing quite an uptick in church going, especially among young people. So yeah, 2 years on since starting the Re-Enchanting podcast, where do you feel we are and what's going on in the culture? And has the church really done anything, or is it just sort of the fact that, you know, things change around us sometimes?
Yeah, I think that is it. And I don't think it's any great sort of successful strategy by any church in particular. Kind of might make you believe in God in the end, mightn't it? That these things kind of happen. And I suppose, I mean, there clearly is something going on more widely. I don't think it's necessarily a massive turning to the church yet. I think what it is a kind of openness to the spiritual, to the transcendent, to realizing that a lot of the secular narratives really haven't delivered over time. And where else do you turn? And Christianity is kind of still around in the debris of kind of late modern European life. And so, and you know, we all know the I think what strikes me about it, what maybe has changed in 2 years, is that back then, you know, we were aware of a number of sort of significant public figures who were interested in Christianity, the whole Tom Holland effect with Dominion. Obviously, there are stories of people like, you know, Ian Hirsi-Ali and Russell Brand and everybody else, these public figures. I suppose what strikes me now is the frequency with which you get this sort of sense of people, again, prominent figures expressing something that's heading in that direction. So whether it's, you know, Giles Coren, who is Jewish by background, suddenly saying, well, actually, yeah, I go to church, or whether it's, I read an article at the weekend by James Marriott, who's not a Christian, but saying, well, you know, maybe we are kind of hardwired to believe as human beings. And actually, maybe it's atheism that was the sort of blip in human evolution, that there was this group of relatively affluent, privileged, you know, Westerners towards the end of the second millennium who happened to think there wasn't a God, but, you know, it didn't last very long. And so it's that. And I suppose the other thing that strikes me about it, I've been reflecting on, is the forms of Christian faith that people have been attracted to. So the report you referenced, the Bible Society report, Justin, seemed to suggest that people were turning to things like, you know, Pentecostalism, Roman Catholicism, sort of Eastern Orthodoxy. I was in Liverpool at the weekend and passed by a Greek Orthodox church. So I knocked on the door and someone let me in, and we had a little look around, and I was asking him about it, because I'm quite interested in the Orthodox church myself. And he said, you know, just over Easter, we've had more people than I've ever seen here in church for the 30 years that I've been involved in this place. And so it seems that people are kind of attracted to the kind of, not to the sort of semi-skimmed or low-fat versions of Christianity, but the sort of full-fat version, a kind of quite demanding form of Christianity that you get in those.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned that you sort of asked that church leader about what they've been seeing, because I did a sort of very informal kind of survey on my social media asking whether church leaders had seen any significant bump this past Easter. And again, this is something anecdotal and self-selecting, but there was just such an influx of stories of, this is the biggest numbers we've ever seen. Like, you know, disregarding the fact COVID was kind of this firebreak in church attendance, there are a lot of people saying we're now seeing more people than we've ever had at our Easter services, you know, at any point in our history. So it's something, does feel like that survey is reflecting something that's happening for people on the ground.
Yeah. And that focuses specifically on England and Wales, but there's a sense that it's not a UK-only phenomenon, which is also incredibly exciting, and also debunks the idea that we had anything to do with it. Yeah,
and you hear it in Europe, you hear it sometimes in the United States. I've been there a couple of times this year already, and it's a fairly sort of common phenomenon across the Western world, I think, right now.
Well, it's worth saying for listeners and viewers that the three of us are going to be sort of diving into this in a lot more depth.
Yes.
At the Wildfires Festival this summer. At the Whiston Estate?
Whiston Estate, yeah, in Sussex.
The end of July.
Yeah.
We'll be getting together to do a sort of live edition of the Re-Enchanting podcast.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
So you can join us there, or it will be a live edition of the Re-Enchanting podcast. We can bring it to you.
Yeah,
indeed. So we'll park that there, not because it's not interesting, because it's too interesting and we will get carried away. And instead, we will turn our minds to Blaise Pascal, the man you've spent the last few years with, really, in many ways. Some people might know a little of him. Some people he might just be a name to them. That's sort of where I stood before a few years ago. So just give us a quick 5 minutes on who on earth he was and is.
Yeah. Well, he was born in 1623 in a place called Clermont, which is kind of in the Auvergne district of France, which is sort of middle of the south of France. It's a town called Clermont-Ferrand today, but it was called Clermont at the time. He was born into a fairly conventional Catholic family. His mother died when he was 3 years old, so he doesn't really have many memories of her. His father was a really important figure in his life because his father was quite involved in the kind of intellectual, philosophical discussions around France at the time. And his father kind of recognized that in his son, Blaise, he had a bit of a sort of child genius, and so decided to homeschool him and his two sisters. So he had an older sister, Gilberte, who was the sort of good, solid, workaday older sister who organized the family, and a younger sister who was called Jacqueline, who was actually quite a significant figure in her own right. She became a kind of a nun in a particular sort of movement of Catholicism in France, which we'll talk about in a moment. They were very, very close, Jacqueline and Blaise. Anyway, he grew up in his early years fascinated by mathematics. So there's a story of when he's about 12 years old, where his father decides to kind of teach him Latin. In fact, the only teacher speaks Latin to him on Wednesdays and Fridays. He's not allowed to speak French at that point.
Standard family life in the Blaise household as well.
Exactly, of course. I can imagine nothing else. But, he said in mathematics, you have to wait a little bit later on because that's almost such a big thing. You've got to wait until later on. So he would study sort of languages and literature and everything else. Anyway, he stumbles upon young Blaise, age 12, making some signs on the floor with a bit of chalk, and he suddenly realizes that basically Pascal has discovered Euclidean geometry on his own,
just off his own bat.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
And so he's not quite sure whether to be really cross with him because he shouldn't be doing mathematics already, or amazed. And his kind of wonder and gratitude and he's very pleased father. Overcomes his reluctance. Anyway, so Pascal is fascinated by this. He grows up. He then starts doing some experiments on some really interesting sort of scientific questions at the time, like the existence of the vacuum or whether air has weight. He does some sort of geometric calculations on things like conic sections, which we won't go into what that means, but very interesting to mathematicians and geometers. So he's really known as a sort of scientist in those times. Now, his family is then kind of accidentally becomes influenced by a movement in 17th century France called Jansenism, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go along. The story goes how his father slipped on a patch of ice one sort of winter's day, and what you did at the time is you got the bone setters to come in. He dislocated his hip, and the bone setters would come in and maneuver the body, the bones around. And these bone setters happened to be Jansenists, which was a kind of real kind of radical form of Christianity at the time, and they kind of converted the family to Jansenism. Jacqueline, his sister, was particularly affected by it. Pascal was, to a certain extent, drawn into the sort of Jansenist circles, made him take his faith a little bit more seriously. But he carried on doing his sort of scientific work and his sort of mathematical work at the same time as taking his faith a little bit more seriously. But that was always a bit of a struggle for Pascal, and because the Jansenists tended to say, if you're really serious about God, you should give up all the kind of worldly stuff like mathematics and physics and all that kind of thing. And so some of his Jansenist friends were saying, you're a bit too drawn into the world. You should leave all this stuff behind. But Pascal sort of felt, well, actually, no, there's good things to do. There's nothing wrong with doing these things. And so that was a bit of a struggle for him. A key moment for Pascal is in 1654, where he has a very powerful experience of the presence of God after a period of sort of spiritual searching and wondering. And as a result of that, he then, a number of things happen as a result of that. One is he starts writing down notes for a grand apology for the Christian faith, the kind of argument for the Christian faith that he wants to make, which he never finished. He died before it was finished, but after after he died, his family found all these notes and published them as the Pensées, the thoughts of Pascal. So he writes the Pensées, or doesn't write, well, he can write them and they get published later on. He also writes a thing called the Provincial Letters. He gets involved in the Jansenist arguments with the Jesuits at the time. And he writes these satirical letters, which are very funny.
And published anonymously.
Published anonymously under the name of Louis de Montalte rather than Pascal. And there's a really interesting story about how, the police and the kind of Jesuits are all trying to hunt out who is this person who's writing these scurrilous things that have gone viral.
Sounds a bit like Bridgerton, but slightly more serious version.
It is, exactly, yeah. And so, he does this. He gets very passionately concerned for the poor of Paris and France. And as a result of that, he invents buses. I'll tell you that story if you want.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go on. Tell us how Pascal invented the bus system.
Is this a Graham Tomlin thesis, or is this a widely
No, this is generally true. What happened, so the city of Paris basically doubled in size in the first half of the 17th century, which was fine if you were rich, because you could get in your carriage and you could drive around and you could get around the city quite easily. If you were poor, it was quite a problem, because if you lived right at the south of Paris and your family were up in the north, it could take you a long, long time to get there. Anyway, it occurs to Pascal one day when he's wandering around the streets of Paris, what if we got a whole lot of carriages to kind of go from point A to point B, and along the way it would stop at various points and people could get on at various points and pay a very small amount, 5 sols, 5 pence was the kind of amount. So it's called the carrosse à 5 sols, the carriage of the 5-cent carriage, if you like. So he was a bit of an entrepreneur, a bit of a sort of businessman. He got a lot of his wealthy friends to kind of invest in this company. They set up a company. They established 5 lines that went from different parts of Paris to each other. And they would go along and they would stop and people could get on the carriage, pay a very small amount and go as long as they wanted to and get off. And so basically that's the first sort of proper urban transportation system in Europe. And it was Pascal's idea. And it came out of his concern for the poor. Anyway, so he just finished the story. It's worth noting the other thing that's true about Pascal is he suffered a lot of sickness. He once said he never had a day without pain in his adult life. And he died aged 39 in 1662.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Can you tell us a little bit about the ideas that were swirling around and the ones he particularly engaged with?
Yeah. I mean, he lives at a kind of interesting time because he's right at the heart of the kind of rising tide of science in 17th century Europe. This is a time when a lot of scientific discovery is being made, and he's right at the heart of that. And so, he has a real kind of interest in those kind of questions, not just in the science itself, but if you like, the sort of philosophy of science, what we think is happening in science, how do you establish what is true, and those kind of questions. I suppose the two broad strands of thinking that I think he's engaged with, which actually have some parallels to our day, I think. One is what you might call the rationalist strand, which is associated with a contemporary of his, who is René Descartes. Descartes was a little bit older than Pascal. They met once, didn't go well. Pascal was quite ill at the time. He was in bed. Descartes came to visit and started lecturing him on what he should do to get better, and they didn't get on.
Wow.
And in fact, in the Pensées, Pascal sometimes writes some rather rude things about Descartes. Descartes. I think there's one that somebody says, Descartes, fruitless and useless.
Yeah.
And so
it's
Descartes
kind of a shame, isn't it? Because two of the most significant minds in Europe, and they just spend it having a bit of a grumble at each other. You'd wish that there was a slightly better story that comes out of that, but never mind. Yeah.
But I suppose, so Descartes represents this strand that is very confident about human reason and its capacity to understand the world. And that by the use of human reason, we can understand everything. And Descartes, of course, has his famous great soundbite, I think, therefore I am, and which is part of his quest for certainty. Where do you find something that's certain? The one thing I can be certain of is the fact that I am thinking, that I am. And so therefore you approach the world from that perspective, that, and if you like, subtly in that moment, the center of the world has shifted from the idea of God is the one you can be certain of to the fact that I am the one I can be certain of. And God therefore becomes a kind of the product of an argument.
A sort of hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. So one of Pascal's famous phrases is the God of the philosophers. And he kind of means Descartes' God. He was really not a living, breathing, the God of Jesus Christ for him. It's the kind of God who is the logical product of a range of arguments. So there's the rationalist strand, which is very confident about human reason. But then on the other side, in 17th century France, there was what we call the skeptical strand, which is represented by a figure called figure like Michel de Montaigne, who was not a contemporary of Pascal's. He was from the previous century, but was very influential at the time. And Montaigne was very different from Descartes. His great theme, if Pascal is, if Descartes is, I think therefore I am. Montaigne's great statement is, "What do I know? Que sais-je? What do I know?"
It's very left v right hemisphere of the brain, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's very, so, Montaigne is a real skeptic, saying we can't really know anything for sure. So much of what we do is custom. It's just kind of random. He's, he is a believer. In fact, both of them are believers in God. Neither of them are atheists. It's important to say that. And in some ways, they map onto some really interesting parallels for our day, I think, because Descartes kind of represents that very kind of rationalist, scientific, we can understand the world by the application of the scientific method and human reason. Montaigne represents slightly the more kind of postmodern, there isn't really anything such thing as truth out there. Everything can be deconstructed. Everything is custom. And so Pascal positions himself between these two strands of thought all the way through his own life, which I think has some interesting parallels to our day.
So was Pascal, as it were, part of that rationalist Enlightenment enterprise? Because he was a scientist, a mathematician. He was kind of trying to map the world in all of those ways. And yet a lot of people have said, while that was wonderful and arguably, was inspired by Christianity in many ways, it was also sowing the seeds for the sort of demise of Christianity by, as you say, coming to understand everything in this very left hemispheric way of thinking about things. So where does Pascal stand then in terms of his contribution there?
Yeah. I mean, I think he's an interesting figure in that, because in one sense he is part of the kind of emerging Enlightenment, because he's key to the kind of whole scientific exploration and the rise of science in the modern world. He's a great devotee of the experimental method in science, which again is quite modern in some ways. So that, for example, before that, it was often thought that, in scientific discovery, a scientific theory can be true if an ancient authority says it, whether it's Aristotle or Plato or the Bible or the Catholic Church. You go on authority. And Pascal says, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. Scientific theories are true if you can show them to have evidence. And so he says you must do experiments. In fact, he does one of the very first modern experiments, which is all to do with the existence of the vacuum. And so he has this insistence that actually no, science must proceed by finding good evidence for what theory you come up with for the way things are. But the big difference between him and someone like Descartes, or even further, someone like David Hume, who is definitely an atheist philosopher, who wants to say, well, we take that sort of evidential method and we expand it to everything else, including God, and then ask themselves the question, well, where's the evidence for God? And because that's sometimes hard to find, think, well, God can't exist like everything else. Pascal makes a very strict distinction between the experimental method in science, which is really useful, and reason is a very valid thing to use in the scientific, but God is not like that. God is not an object in the world that you can analyze in a test tube in the same way that you can measure, that you can see how it fits into the cause and effect of things. God is of a different order altogether. So actually reason is pretty limited in terms of its ability to help us access God. So he makes this very strict distinction between, he says, reason has its limits. One of the last insights of reason is to realize that there are many things that are beyond it, is what he says. So he has this and that's a big difference between him and Descartes, I think. Descartes is one to say, well, reason can help us understand the world, but it can also help us find God. And actually Pascal says, no, it can't. He actually says, it's the heart that understands God, not the reason.
Yes. What's that famous phrase he uses? The heart has its reasons.
The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. And what he means by that is sometimes that's been interpreted as being, well, that's about, emotion. It's about romance and so on. I think Wallace Simpson, who was the woman who
led to the
abdication
of
King Edward. Wrote a book saying the heart has its reasons, basically saying, well, romance is more important than anything else. And that's entirely not what Pascal was talking about. What he means by the heart is a kind of deep sense of instinct. There are certain things that you can't argue yourself towards, but you just have to assume they're true. And so he talks about things like the number of infinity. No one knows what the number of infinity is, but we kind of have a sense that there is such a thing as infinity, even if we don't know what it is. You have to kind of assume it. He says the same is true of God, that you can't prove God, you can't reason yourself to God. You kind of almost have to assume that God is there and then look at the world from that perspective and see where it makes sense. And so that's what I think he means by the heart, a kind of deep instinct that says, I kind of sense that God is there. And so let me try and look at the world through that lens and live as if that's true.
Yeah. I remember I had a university lecturer once. He wasn't a Christian, but he said he does sort of believe in God. And his reason was, I believe in God because he's the biggest thing we've ever been able to imagine.
Yeah.
So if we have an inkling that he must be there and all of us have it and we can't get bigger than God or beyond him, I wonder if it's because he's there, which I always found quite an interesting way of phrasing it.
And it's a version of for those sort of geeks in philosophy and theology, the ontological argument of St. Anselm and others that, God is that being which is greater than anything we can ever imagine. There must be a source of everything that is good. And Pascal has a version of that as well.
Was this the way he thought? He has this very famous Night of Fire.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really annoying about Pascal, right, is that he's excellent at everything, including writing.
Yeah, exactly.
So imagine being like a genius at all things and then having this way with words that, fine, whatever. But I'm not jealous, it's fine. So he had this Night of Fire. Is this the way he thought about God before that? Or did everything change?
No, he did think about God before that. I mean, in some ways, the Night of Fire is a very powerful personal experience. And it does sort of shift things to a certain extent in terms of his sort of philosophical and theological approaches, but not radically, because I think a lot of these trajectories were already there.
Okay.
So the Night of Fire is, to say, towards the early 1650s. Pascal is kind of in his 30s at this sort of point. He goes through what some Pascal scholars have called his période mondaine, this worldly period. And it's been what he's really interested in is science and his experiments, and he's getting quite well known for them. And that seems to be kind of capturing his imagination. But at the same time, he's got these Jansenist friends saying, well, you shouldn't really be into all this worldly stuff. You should devote yourself to God instead. And he's sort of tussling with
bone setting, though, that's exempt from being worldly.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that was a kind of means to get into houses like this. To kind of,
great evangelism strategy. Bone setting.
I know. Try. You need to try it. So here's this sort of internal struggle going on, and it's kind of resolved to a certain extent by this powerful experience that he has. So on a November night in 1654, he writes about how, what seems to have happened in his sort of flat in Paris. He describes it very, very, gives the time, between sort of 10:30 at night and midnight for 2 hours. He seems to have had this very visceral, powerful experience of the presence of God. And he never told anybody about it. In fact, the only reason we know about it is because he wrote down an account of the experience, and he scribbled it really quickly, then wrote another version, which is a bit more sort of careful. And he folded these bits of paper up and he put them inside his jacket, and he sewed them up inside his jacket. And every time he changed his jacket, he would take them out, put them back in again. Never told anybody. When he died, one of the servants who was preparing his body for burial kind of cut open the jacket and thought, well, there's something there, and opened it up and pulled out these bits of paper. And there it was, with the date, the time, and then and it has the word fire at the top. And then it describes this fiery encounter with the God of Jesus Christ, not the God of the philosophers. And this sense of wanting to devote himself fully to this God from now on. And this seems to be a really powerful experience for him. And the result of that, I think, is three main things. It's one is the pensée, this thing where, God has seemed to become to him the consuming desire of his heart. That doesn't mean that he gives up on his science. I think he seems to have found a way to kind of hold the two things together. he desperately wants to communicate this to his sophisticated friends who don't take religion very seriously, find God rather boring. And so he starts writing the Pensées. He gets involved with the Jansenist movement, his friends who are there, and he writes these provincial letters to help them in their fight with the Jesuits at the time. And he gets very interested in the poor because he thinks that's a crucial part of Christian discipleship, which leads to the buses and everything else. And so it has this practical effect on what he does. But I think the general strand of his thought that he's trying to position himself between sort of skepticism and rationalism, because was kind of always there from the early days. Yeah.
Seeing the account of this Night of Fire sort of put me in mind of other great Christian thinkers, intellects, and so on, who perhaps have had similar experiences. I mean, John Wesley, there was his famous sort of strange warming of the heart that seemed to be a catalyst to his sudden transformation, in terms of his faith and what he went on to do. Was it Aquinas who also had sort of one of these moments where towards the end of his life, having done all these amazing intellectual sort of feats, said this one moment sort of made it all feel like, was it straw?
Yeah, more like straw.
So I just wonder if you could speak to that there is almost a tradition in terms of this juxtaposition of the intellectual inquiry in search for God and this very raw experiential thing that sometimes happens. And often I wonder whether it always gets reconciled for some people. The two.
Yeah. And I don't think it entirely gets reconciled for Pascal. I mean, one of the things he's involved with around that time is a correspondence with Pierre de Fermat. You've probably heard of Fermat's last theorem, French mathematician, and they have this correspondence on probability. And again, we can talk about that as we go on. But it's basically, how do you predict things? So if you've got a game of cards or a game of tossing coins, and people have bet on the outcome, and halfway through the game finishes, how do you predict the end of it? How do you allocate the stake? And they have this debate on it, and it's basically the beginnings of probability theory, on the basis of which we do most of our insurance calculations. A huge amount of our life is based on the calculation of risk. A lot of that goes back to Pascal. So he's involved in this debate with Fermat, this really interesting thing. Now, as a result of the Night of Fire, he kind of writes to Fermat and says, to be honest, I'm not really interested in this much anymore. Something else has become so much more important to me. And he turns his intellectual attention not from, away from that particular puzzle, which seems interesting to him, but not life, not life altering and not crucial, towards the different intellectual puzzle, which is how do you convince skeptical people or people who find God boring that actually their greatest good and happiness can be found in God. And that's the puzzle he applies himself to at that point. He carries on doing scientific experiments. He often suffers from really bad toothache. And sometimes to take his mind off the toothache, he gives himself mathematical puzzles to sort out.
That's how I deal with all of my illnesses as well, yeah.
That's right. And so, it's not that he gives up on his intellectual searchings, but that this sort of visceral experience of the presence of God becomes really, really important to him. And I think he would say that's kind of the heart of Christian faith. And the kind of Christian faith he talks about is one which is, if you're going to do this thing, do it properly. This is a God who isn't the logical result of an argument, a process of argument. This is a passionate God, the God of Jesus Christ, who comes to you and who possesses your heart and who captures your imagination and your vision. And that's the kind of God we're dealing with here. So it's almost as if he kind of almost discovers a new kind of God at that point that he'd sort of heard about but hadn't experienced until that moment.
Which, as you said, you gave an outline of some of the things it led to, one of them being his Pensées.
Pensées. That's right, yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that is for anyone who hasn't heard of that before? Yeah.
Well, he always had these very sophisticated friends who were kind of the gentlemen of 17th century France. The phrase in the French was honnête homme, honest men. Gentlemen would be our translation, I suppose. And these were people who were educated, sophisticated, kind of men about town. They went to the salons, they engaged in witty conversation, they were interested in women, in gambling, playing tennis, playing billiards, and doing all these kind of fun things. they weren't that interested in God. They would talk about the latest scientific or philosophical theories. They would discuss Descartes in their salons at a fairly shallow level, perhaps. But he always had these friends, and one of the things they were very interested in was gambling. And so he, after this night of fire, he wants to kind of convey to them what he has discovered, this powerful experience of the presence of God, which has brought him real happiness. Mm-hmm. You can, in the Memorial, which is the account of the night of fire, he talks about, certainty, joy. This has been an outpouring of joy for him, and he wants other people to share this. And so he thinks, how am I going to do this? And so he thinks, well, I want to write a kind of argument for Christianity, which is not a set of sort of logical proofs of God. It's not that at all. But it's a whole different approach to it. And so what he starts to do is to write down thoughts that come to him. And sometimes they're just a line. Sometimes they're more like a paragraph. Sometimes they're like whole essays. And he keeps them on sheets of paper. And he goes back to them and he edits them and crosses out bits and adds bits around the margin and so on. Anyway, he never finished this project because he died at age 39 before he was able to finish it. When he died, his friends found all these bits of paper, some of which had been organized into sort of chapters, some of which were just lying around in a rather haphazard fashion. And they thought, well, what do we do with these things? And they thought, well, we kind of got to publish them because they're pretty good. And so they published a version of the Pensée in 1670, 8 years after Pascal died. And it was called the Pensée of Monsieur Pascal on religion and various other subjects. And it sold really pretty quickly. It was translated into English very quickly. Here in Lambeth Palace Library, down below us, they have a third edition, which is from 1671, just a year after the the Pensée was published. And so it's the kind of raw material for a great apology for the Christian faith. In some ways, some people have said that the very fragmentary nature of it, because when you read it, it's not like a kind of whole nice logical argument. It's not like a sequential thing. It's just little bits that you read from time to time. And some people say that fragmentary nature is almost part of the appeal. Yeah. That sometimes you have to sort of sit down and think, hang on, I've got to think about that. Yeah. Before you go on to the next bit, you think, I have no idea what this is.
You sort of have to fill in some of the gaps yourself. Yeah. It forces you to do a bit of thinking yourself.
Yeah.
And you've said a couple of times now, it's not a kind of traditional, rational approach to evidence for God. So what are the Pensées? What are some of the key ideas if it's not that sort of traditional way of arguing for God?
Yeah. Well, I think what Pascal does is he's great at describing the human condition in a very modern way. So he has these descriptions in the Pensée of what it is to be human in the modern world in a way that couldn't have been written 100 years before. So here's this famous sentence, which in French goes, le silence éternel des espaces infinis m'effraie. The eternal silence of infinite space terrifies me. Now, he's living in a world where the telescope has been invented, not long before. And so, in other words, human beings were now aware of how tiny this planet was and how insignificant human life seems to be on this tiny little planet, which is not the center of the solar system. The sun is. We seem to be a tiny planet in a particular galaxy, and we're one little speck of life on it. And that's a terrifying thought for him. And whereas before, maybe 100 years or so before, people would have thought, well, this world was made for us. We are the center of everything. And because of the Copernican revolution, which made people realize that the Earth is not the center of the universe, because of the invention of the telescope, he's able to describe this sense of complexity. So one of the arguments he makes is this enigma that is humanity, that seems so insignificant, but yet somehow we also think is quite significant at the same time. And this is the reality. And so Descartes has this very noble idea of humanity, that we're full of reason. We're able to understand the world. We can use our reason to understand everything. We have great capacity. And you think of our capacity to do good and to create beauty and love and everything that is wonderful about humanity. And yet, on the other hand, you've got Montaigne with his pretty reductionist idea of humanity, and Pascal is very aware of also, we have this great capacity to understand the world and to create beauty, but we also have the great capacity for cruelty and for ugliness and for destruction. So what do you make of this enigma that is humanity? He talks about humanity as the glory and refuse of the universe. This is the kind of dilemma of what we are. We're the glory of the universe, but we're the refuse of the universe. And so he kind of sets up these sort of real kind of puzzles. And then he says, well, actually, Christian faith kind of helps you understand that, because Christian faith talks about humanity as both created and fallen, that we are created by God with these remarkable gifts of reason, of love, of creativity, of beauty. But we've also radically fallen from that place by turning away from the source of life, which is God himself. And that kind of explains how we are both the glory and the refuse of the universe. So another example would be, he actually says, is there much evidence for God? Well, not really. He kind of says, apart from faith, there's no particular reason to know whether we're created by a good God or an evil demon. Who knows? And so he actually glories in the paradoxes of Christianity, the fact that, Christianity is, he says, one point, Christianity is strange. It's not obviously true. You can't point to a set of arguments that logically tie it up and say, here it is, it's true. And so he says, if there is a God, he must be a hidden God, a God who sort of hides himself from us, who doesn't make himself obvious to us. But then he says, well, actually, kind of that fits with what Christianity says, because Christianity says that God reveals himself primarily in an obscure Jewish rabbi who lived in the 1st century, who you could meet and you could shake the hand of, with entirely miss the fact that you were shaking the hand of God. In other words, God is hidden in the person of Jesus Christ, in the very place where God is revealed. You would also, as a good Catholic Christian, say, when you go to church and you're given bread and wine, God is present in that gift as well. That God is always hidden. God always comes to us in hidden form. That's what Christianity says about God. And so he kind of says that sort of fits. But what Christianity says about God, that God is a hidden God, fits with the kind of ambiguity of the evidence for God and the fact that science can't really give you any hard and fast proof of God at the same time. So I think what he tries to do in the Pensée is to kind of throw up the ambiguities, the questions, the mystery of human life, and begin to show how Christian faith makes sense of it in a way that other things don't.
A lot of what you're describing there might be new information for a lot of people, might send them back to the Pensée itself, but certainly they'll get a really good idea of it from reading your own book. But where people might have heard of Pascal, apart from, his association with scientific measurements for pressure and things like that, is something called Pascal's wager.
Yep.
And that's certainly where I first bumped into the name of Pascal. Now, I'm going to give a very kind of schoolboy, probably inadequate version of this that often gets passed around, and then you can correct me. But essentially, when I first bumped into this sort of doing A-levels or something, someone said to me, oh, have you heard this argument that basically you should believe in God because you're better off, you won't lose anything by throwing your lot in with God, whereas you could lose a lot if you don't believe in God. So basically, you're better kind of betting your life on God. And I immediately felt like, that doesn't work because you can't just choose to believe in God, sort of, So I always thought, whoever this Pascal person is, he wasn't a very good thinker, because this argument doesn't seem to
simple,
So tell me where my schoolboy sort of idea of Pascal's wager went wrong, from someone who obviously knows exactly what he meant by it.
Yeah, well, Pascal's wager comes as one of the fragments of the Pensée. It's quite one of the longer ones, and it's worth reading quite carefully because it probably would have played an important part in his argument. And I think the argument goes like this. So, think about this thing he's been doing with Pierre de Fermat, this bit about games that get interrupted halfway through and you're trying to predict the result of the game. And he kind of thinks life is a bit like that, because we're in the middle of this game. And he says at one point, there's a coin being tossed at the far end of the universe. It's going to come down heads or tails. God exists or God doesn't. What are you going to bet? And he then has this kind of conversation with a friend, and it's in the form of a conversation. And the friend says, well, do I have to bet? Pascal says, yep, you do. In fact, if you've already bet, because the way you live your life, you're either living your life as if God exists or he doesn't. If you're living your life as if God doesn't exist, you've already bet one way or the other. So you can't avoid this bet. You've got to make a choice one way or the other. And so the friend says, okay, well, if I've got a bet, is there any sort of evidence? Is there stuff to push me one way or the other? And Pascal says, well, not really. There is some evidence, scriptural prophecy, miracles, they give you some indication, but to be honest, there's stuff on the other side that might suggest there isn't a God. And so the guy says, well, what do I do? And Pascal says, okay, well, let's work out the probability of this. A bit like he's done with the game, the tossing coins. And he says, well, tossing coins, is that right? Exactly. So he said, let's work out the probability. And he then goes into this sort of mathematical bit, which is kind of like what you say, where he says, okay, if you bet that God doesn't exist, and you're right, well, you haven't gained a great deal. You know, you can live your life and, you know, have fun, but then you just go into nothingness. But you potentially lose a great deal if you're wrong. Because if you're wrong, then who knows what's going to happen afterwards if you bet that God doesn't exist. Whereas if you bet that God does exist, and you're wrong, well, again, you haven't lost a great deal. But if you're right, you stand to gain a huge win. So it's kind of the same logic as the lottery. You know, you bet a tiny amount on the possibility that it might be true. Now, as you say, a lot of people have said, well, yeah, it kind of works as an argument, but it doesn't really kind of convince you. But I think for Pascal, the point of the argument was not to kind of push people into belief, because what he says towards the end of this argument, once he's done this bit of philosophical, mathematical argumentation, he says to his friend, well, look, if you're really being logical about this, if you were being rational, if you were doing the probability, you'd always bet on belief, because the odds are so stacked in that favor, in that direction. You know, you stand to win a great deal if you but not lose much if you bet on faith, whereas you stand to lose a great deal and you're not going to gain very much if you bet on unbelief. And so you'd always bet on that. And but then he says to the guy, well, you don't, do you? Then he says, no, I don't. And he said, well, at least get it into your head. The reason you don't believe is not because of your reason, it's because of your passions. In other words, the reason why you don't believe is not because you're being rational about it, but it's because you don't want to believe. And that's I think that's what Pascal is driving at. He's not pushing people into belief. He's trying to uncover the core reasons for unbelief, which are not primarily rational or logical. They're all about the heart. They're all about desire. They're all about the fact that people just don't want to believe. That's kind of where he's driving at. Now, the interesting thing then is the guy comes back and says, okay, well, I can't force myself to believe something I don't believe, which is the point you make, Justin. And Pascal says, yeah, I get that. I get that. You can't make yourself believe something you don't. And but then he says, well, so the guy says, well, what do I do? And he says, well, try living as if it's true. Try acting as if it's true. Start, going to mass, taking holy water, reading the Bible, praying as if God is there. Even if you don't believe it, just try it out for a bit. Because only then you will put yourself in a position where it might be possible that you do encounter this God who he encountered on the night of fire. And so that, I think, is what the wager is trying to do, is trying to uncover the real reasons for unbelief and try to put someone in the position where they might make themselves available to be encountered by God, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. My brother's reading the Ponces at the moment, and he sent me a little quote. I can't remember the full thing, but it's the final two words are your heart's intuitions.
Yeah.
And he really loved that.
Yeah.
And that's still, we've got Lamorna Ash in this series, and she basically did that. She sort of toured the UK and then started getting involved.
Went along, got involved without necessarily believing it, but sort of just seeing what happens if I start to act as if God might.
Yeah. And has landed in an incredibly interesting and probably surprising to hear place.
Just very brief digression. Back in my Unbelievable days, we kind of did an interesting experiment that sort of was slightly based on Pascal's wager, but Tim Mawson, who's a Christian philosopher in Oxford, came up with this rather interesting paper in which he said, philosophically speaking, atheists should pray to ask God to reveal himself because they've got nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain. It's a kind of, it's a bit of a Pascalian sort of wager. So I invited him and we actually put this into practice, and we did a 40-day atheist prayer experiment in which I invited atheists who listened to the show to just for 40 days, every day, to pray for God to reveal himself to them. And it was a lot of fun. Some very interesting results came out of it. I won't tell you what happened, but there are interesting ways in which Pascal's thoughts continue to kind of,
And I think Pascal would say that might be a good way to do. What you can't do is sort of say, well, I'll sort of sit back and sort of see whether God turns up.
Yeah.
In a very skeptical way. You've got to engage with it. You've got to actually practice the Christian faith. You've got to go to church as if it really is the place where you meet God. You've got to take bread and wine as if God is meeting you at that point. You've got to read the Bible as if it's God speaking to you. You've got to pray as if God might actually be listening to you. So you've got to actually engage with it. You've got to take it seriously. You can't just sort of keep it at arm's length. So, yeah.
What's really interesting about Pascal, So this might not have been language or an idea that was present when he was making these arguments, but now we have this whole language about being spiritual but not religious. As in, yeah, spiritually I'm okay, but I don't want to put a story around it. I don't want to put parameters around it. I don't want to tie it to any one tradition, one story, one set of beliefs. And so Pascal's Night of Fire, when he writes, am I right in thinking that he writes, joy, certainty, fire, and then he says the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob.
Yep.
And so he's like, all of this stuff is happening, and I'm tying it to this one story, this one tradition. And it made me think also of when we had Martin Shaw on, and he had this he had a Night of Fire in every kind of way.
Yeah.
And he had this wild thing where he saw arrows coming from the sky and words appearing in his mind. And then all of a sudden he was like, okay, Jesus. And I remember asking him, like, how did you know, though? You tie it to something so specific. How did you know this wasn't just an abstract thing? So obviously that's very different for Pascal, because I don't even know if spiritual but not religious was an accepted thing, whether that would have even existed. But what might he say to that idea that you can be spiritual but not religious now, do you think?
Yeah. And it's one of the contrasts between, say, Pascal's Christian faith and that of Descartes and Montaigne, who were Catholic Christians who would go to church and take mass and everything else. But they don't mention Jesus very much. But there's very little of Jesus in either Montaigne or Descartes' religion. And it's almost as if God is a kind of idea that is sort of present, but not immediately present. And it is the God of Jesus Christ that he discovers on the Night of Fire. A very specific God, not just the God who is the architect of the universe, the Descartes God who sort of flicks his fingers and brings the world into being, and who sort of sits out there, the kind of deist God who is just the kind of person who set the thing off and isn't really involved in it anymore. This is a God who comes close to you all the time and who kind of almost demands everything within you. So I think he would say that on the one hand, there is something very specific about this God, and it's exactly the same thing as you say with Martin Shaw's thing, that yes, it's extraordinary experience, but no, it's this God we're talking about here. I think another thing he'd say about spiritual but not religious is that it's one thing to have, vague experiences of God and say, oh, this is kind of nice, it's comforting that there's something out there, but I don't want it to change my life. Pascal would say this kind of has to change your life. It has to change your desires. It has to, in fact, he's a deeply Augustinian thinker. St. Augustine is very important to him, whose key idea is that grace unlocks the heart, divine kind of intervention changes our hearts and our desires. And so he kind of feels that. But that when your heart's desire changes, you kind of have to discipline yourself in that. So it's a bit like, anything worth doing in life, playing the piano, learning the cello, learning how to play tennis, learning mathematics, whatever. It takes discipline. It means you've got to sort of not do certain things to give yourself discipline of, getting fit or, doing your scales on the piano. You have to kind of close off some options and devote yourself to a particular set of practices. Otherwise, you just end up with this vague thing about, I kind of like music, but I can't play it, I can't create it or anything like that at all. So anything worth doing is worth disciplining yourself to. And that does mean closing off certain options and focusing on ones that are there, which is kind of what Pascal sort of says towards the end of the wager. If you're going to take this seriously, if you're really serious about trying to find God, even if you don't believe he's there, well, start practicing the Christian disciplines. Start devoting yourself to this particular God in this particular way, rather than thinking, okay, I am the judge of everything, and I know what's best for me, saying, well, actually, maybe I don't. Maybe I need to submit myself to a pattern of discipline that others have set before me, because these are people who have found this God, and they testify to me that if I do this, I might find the same God as well. And so I think that's what he'd say, that spirituality takes you so far, but religion, in other words, they're kind of the disciplines of a specific God and specific practices, that's the only thing that can really help you discover the real happiness and the real joy that comes from Christian faith in a long-term way.
Yeah, and that it's interesting because I think, I've heard some people talking about the fact that they're now thinking themselves as religious but not spiritual, the kind of inverse of the spiritual but not religious, because they're actually looking for something specific, a tradition to sit in rather than just this nebulous spirituality, because that's fine, but it doesn't really do anything for you in the end. Is their problem. And they're kind of, some of these people are people who aren't even sure whether God exists, but they're kind of doing the Pascal thing. I'm going to turn up for church. I'm going to see what it's sort of the Giles Corran thing, you know. I'm not entirely sure about all this, but I'm going along every Sunday and kind of trying it out, basically.
And I think it's a bit, I mean, this isn't really a Pascal argument, but I think, you know, because a lot of contemporary spirituality is a bit sort of pick and mix. I'll do, you know, a little statue of the Buddha in the corner. I'll buy some crystals. I'll kind of do some mindfulness. I'll pick the bits of the different religious traditions that I kind of like. And that is a very kind of late, you know, early 21st century consumerist approach to religion. But it's a bit like trying to learn a language and thinking, well, I quite like Portuguese verbs, but I also quite like French nouns. And I kind of like, you know, the syntax of Latin, and I'll kind of blend them all together. That doesn't really work. You kind of have to say, okay, I'm going to learn French. Yes. Or I'm going to learn Welsh, or I'm going to learn, you know, German or whatever it is, and put yourself to that particular discipline and learn it. And that's kind of what I think Pascal would say. If you have an instinct, an inkling that there may be something in this Christian thing, well, give yourself to it and submit yourself to that discipline. And in time, you may well find it to be true in that experiential sense that goes beyond just the inkling that it might be true after all.
Yeah, definitely. It's also, you know, Elizabeth Oldfield talks a lot about the fact that we're all being formed. So are you going to choose what's forming you? And I think that really is playing into that. I want to be religious but not spiritual. It's like, I don't even know if God exists, but this feels like good formation. You know, like praying Tomlin, fasting, doing it feels like good formation. And actually, I don't necessarily need the spiritual stuff. So Blaise Pascal is this perfect fusion.
I mean, speaking of which, one of the things that comes across so strongly in the book is the way you tie Pascal's thoughts and insights into what we often experience today, even though he was writing some 400 years ago. So much of what he writes is just absolutely prescient for, and in particular, you focus in one chapter on the distracting ourselves to death is the title of the chapter. And even in his age, Pascal was aware that we have this ability to kind of distract ourselves from what is actually core to life and to existence. And I mean, that's just been magnified and accelerated a billion times in a social media age, 24-hour news cycle. So yeah, what did Pascal kind of recognize at that time, and how does it speak to our current day?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, as you say, one of his big themes in the Pensée is distraction, how easily we are distracted by trivia that stop us from thinking about the really big questions about life and death and eternity and everything else. And no, to be honest, and as you say, that's been magnified in our day. We have these devices in our pockets which give us instant information and distraction.
And a lot of trivia.
Exactly. Now, paradoxically, Pascal is slightly responsible for that because one of the things he did quite young, in his sort of late teens, was to invent a machine called the Pascaline, which was one of the first mechanical calculators in European life. It was brilliant. It could, and he was trying to help his dad. His dad was a tax official. He was trying to work out complicated sums as to what people should pay in their taxes, and he invented this machine which could calculate, you know, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, up to tens and hundreds of millions. So it was a real step forward in terms of the data and calculators, and it's been often seen as a precursor of the modern computer. And in the story of the digital age that leads towards the kind of modern, you know, microchip and digital reality, the Pascaline is a story. So he has a bit of responsibility to it.
So he gave us TikTok, basically.
Well, kind of.
Put that on the cover.
I know, exactly, yeah. But at the same time, you're right. He does talk about that. And I was thinking about it the other day. I was reading an article in the Times magazine about someone who locked herself in the loo. You know, she'd went to the loo and found herself locked in, and she was in her house and no one was coming in for another 24 hours. So she suddenly thought, goodness me, I'm stuck here. And her phone was outside.
I see. She didn't have the phone with her.
Didn't have her phone.
Okay.
So she couldn't ring anybody. No one was coming into the house for 24 hours. And she sort of thought, okay, how do I do this? Okay, well, I'm in the loo. That's fine. I can, you know, I could sleep here if I need to. The loo is big enough. But the thing that terrified her was there was nothing to do. No phone, no books, no radio. She was facing 24 hours of absolute silence with nothing to do. And this was the thought that terrified her more than anything else. And it was a real wake-up call for her. And it made me think of Pascal's famous statement, that the source of all our troubles is that we are unable to stay quiet in a room on our own. That we find it almost impossible just to do nothing and to be alone with our thoughts and to be alone with God even. And we Christians understand that sometimes. Sometimes the last thing you want to do is pray because you want to do stuff and get on with everything else. And so he talks a lot about distraction, and a lot of what he says is very redolent to our times. I think what he would go beyond, our times, is that people would often say, well, okay, yes, we have this capacity of distraction, therefore you need to learn mindfulness, you need to kind of, be present in the moment and everything else. I think he would go beyond that to say there are kind of bigger questions than just being in the present moment that we kind of do need to ponder. So, for example, what happens when we die? We've kind of made the assumption broadly in our culture that when we die, that's it. And we you go to secular funerals and it's celebrating the person's life, but that's the end of the story. What if it's not the end of the story? And that's the kind of question Pascal asks. And that's not trying to terrify it. He's not a kind of hellfire preacher. He's not someone who sort of says, you must fear because of the fires of hell. He's just asking that existential question. What might happen after this life is over? One of the other things he talks about is happiness. He says, every human being, without exception, seeks happiness. But where does that happiness come from? And why do we think we should find happiness? Because the one thing we know about happiness is we know what it feels like, but we also know that it vanishes pretty quickly as soon as you get it. And he says, well, why should we know what happiness is unless we once experienced true happiness? And that's part of his argument of saying, well, maybe we did come from a God who is the source of happiness, is the one who alone can make us happy in the end. And so one of the problems for him of this distraction of trivia is that it takes us away from the source of true happiness. We're kind of satisfied with tiny, trivial things, where actually true happiness is on offer for us. And therefore we miss out on the great goal of true joy and happiness because we are so distracted by the trivial things. Yeah. So it's not just a kind of, think about what happens after you die. It's also, you might be missing out on something that's far greater than you might ever imagine.
It's, relatable to a painful extent, isn't it? I want to end with his quote, which is perhaps the most Re-Enchanting-esque, which is where he talks about religion and he says, make it attractive, make good men, wish it were true, and then show them that it is. And I would just love you to break open his thoughts on that, how he himself went about that. But I'm also wondering in our, does the quiet revival mean that we're making it attractive, or does the decline in numbers mean that we've done a bad job at making it attractive? And how attractive do you think Christianity is right now? If Blaise Pascal could look at the way how we're doing, what would he say, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think the evidence has to be that we haven't done a great job at making it attractive, which is why over the last few centuries, we've kind of lost the imagination of the Western world. Other stories have seemed more attractive. And I think one of the reasons why maybe there is a bit of a turning back to faith at the moment is because a lot of those secular stories don't seem quite so attractive. Whether that's new atheism, whether it's kind of liberalism, or whether it's fascism, whether it's communism, all of those great stories that seemed attractive at one point no longer quite seem to have the allure that they once did. And so maybe there's something in this Christianity after all. So I think he would look back on our time and the intervening time and say we kind of missed a trick, partly by maybe going down the Descartes line of thinking we could somehow prove God, and then people realizing that you can't in the end of the day, and therefore we must jettison God because there's no evidence for him. And Pascal said, well, of course there's no evidence for him. He's not that kind of God. So there's that sort of line of thinking. I mean, how he went about making faith attractive for people, I think, was by this very method of showing the explanatory power of Christianity, that it sort of makes sense of human experience. And he would go into the heart of the complexities, the mystery of human experience, this strange mixture of creativity and ugliness in human life. How do you explain that? How do you explain the fact that God, there's some evidence to suggest that God is there, but a lot of evidence to suggest he isn't. Maybe that points you towards a hidden God, the God hidden in Jesus Christ. He's talking about happiness, the fact that the goal of human life is, the goal of Christian life is not misery, it's not just discipline for its own sake, it is happiness, nothing other than that. he talks about the sovereign good, which is kind of the greatest good we can think of. And so you can imagine, we all have experiences of, I don't know, joy or of wonder or of beauty, and we kind of think, and they're great while they're there, but they're little snippets, they're little kind of glimpses of something much bigger. And Pascal says, well, what are these experiences? Maybe they're part of what he calls the sovereign good, which is God himself. Maybe they're just glimpses into the reality of the God who made us and who offers to redeem us in Christ, and who offers to rescue us. And actually, by taking away some of the distractions, by giving ourselves to the disciplines of the Christian life, we might actually discover this sovereign good, the source of all that is good in our lives, the person from which everything good comes, and who alone can make us truly happy. And those are some of the ways in which I think he tries to make Christian faith attractive for people. And so it's a kind of, back to the full fat version of Christianity. And he felt some of the other sort of forms of Christianity on offer at the time were kind of rather thin versions, which weren't very attractive, which is why so many of his friends weren't drawn to Christian faith. Or he felt that a kind of full fat version of Christianity is the thing that can only make people happy in the end, because it's the thing that puts you in touch with the God who is the source of all good.
Wonderful. Well, we've really scratched the surface here of what is a wonderful sort of deep dive into Pascal's life legacy and what it absolutely means for us today. So we thoroughly recommend, not just because you're the boss here, Graham, but because it is
a little bit because of that.
You don't have to say that.
But actually, this, I really enjoyed reading this book. And so you suddenly realize, wow, we're sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, really, aren't we? So Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world, available now. We'll make sure there's a link from today's show.
We absolutely will. You can also find an article, an extract on Seen and Unseen, where you can also find articles about so many of the topics that we've spoken about today, as usual. And also, if you would like to make further episodes of Re-Enchanting happen, seenandunseen.com/give is the place to go for that too. But until next time, we will say goodbye.